Nancy Hart. I'm a senior program attorney at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and we're pleased to have all of you listening to this pre-application webinar about the Domestic Violence Homicide Prevention Firearms Technical Assistance Project, which you may have seen we have been abbreviating FTAP because it is a long name. I'm going to go ahead and let the other presenters introduce themselves.
Hi, everybody. Thank you again for joining us. My name is Caroline Laporte. I am an attorney and the Senior Native Affairs Policy Advisor with the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center.
Hello, everyone. I am Tricia Bent-Goodley. I am a professor of social work at Howard University and the team director for the Domestic Violence Homicide Prevention Project at Howard University. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Darren Mitchell. I'm a consultant to the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and I work very closely with Nancy on this project. We're so pleased that you can join us this afternoon and excited to share this exciting opportunity.
Thank you, guys. And I also want to mention that this project is a cooperative agreement between the National Council and the Office on Violence Against Women. They are our significant partners on this, and I want to mention that our program specialist at OVW is Aisha Gaston, who is also on the call, although she's not presenting today. So, how do I advance this? Sorry. Okay, here we go. So the learning objectives for today are as follows. During this webinar, you're going to learn about the FTAP project objectives, the timeline and structure, some anticipated activities, benefits for participating communities, and, of course, the application process. You're also going to learn how to conduct collaborative assessment activities with other community stakeholders to help you develop a successful application. And then last, you're going to learn more about the Firearms TA Project's focus on incorporating the voices and needs of traditionally underserved and or marginalized communities. At the end, there will be an opportunity to ask questions about the application process or anything else that we've talked about.
So I'm going to jump in and talk a little bit about why we are focusing on firearms and domestic violence as part of this technical assistance project. And when we work on this issue, and the National Council and I have been working on this issue for close to 20 years, we often discuss it in terms of the impact, the public health impact that abusers' access to firearms poses. And as a way to get people to understand the importance of doing this work, and also that sometimes when folks are hesitant or resistant, to help them overcome that resistance and recognize the value in doing this work. Research shows quite clearly that the single greatest risk factor for intimate partner homicide is an abuser's access to a gun, not necessarily ownership of the gun or usual possession of the firearm, but having access to a gun. Dr. Jacqueline Campbell, who's in my home state of Maryland at Johns Hopkins University, who is the preeminent researcher on risk for intimate partner homicide, has done studies and meta-analyses that show that this is the greatest risk factor over any others in terms of predicting intimate partner homicide. Compared to a home that does not have a gun, the mere presence of a gun increases the risk of a homicide where there's an intimate partner relationship in that home of 8-fold versus a house without a gun. And when there's a prior history of domestic violence, research shows that the increase in likelihood of an intimate partner homicide in the home jumps up all the way to 20-fold. In addition to that, FBI's data about homicides, and specifically about intimate partner homicides, shows that firearms are clearly the weapon of choice. Overall, over the 28-year period described in this slide, and this is continued forward, approximately 2/3 of the intimate partner homicides committed in this country where a female spouse or ex-spouse was killed involved the use of a firearm. That number does vary a little bit state by state. In some states, it's well over 66%, and in others, where there's a little less access to firearms, the number can drop down to closer to 50% of cases. But generally speaking, over these years, guns are used more often in committing intimate partner femicide, especially female spouses or ex-spouses, than all other weapons combined, ligatures, hands, knives, etc. Guns are by far the weapon of choice. There is some promising data that's continuing over the years showing that the proportion of intimate partner homicide victims killed with guns has decreased from 1980 to 2008. We hope and think that it's due to some efforts like this one to try to ensure that the laws that prohibit intimate partner abusers from having access to guns, that those laws have been at least somewhat effective. In addition to thinking about this in terms of a homicide or a femicide problem, we also like to help people understand that access to a gun, in addition to that threat, also research shows that guns are used as an instrument of power and control and coercive control over victims. So threats with guns, brandishing the firearm, just the survivor knowing that there's access to a gun enables abusers to continue their course of coercive control and their power control over victims. Susan Sorensen at the University of Pennsylvania has studied this issue in part through interviews with survivors, and it's a very important thing to keep in mind when we do work in this area, that it's not just about the deaths and serious injuries we're trying to prevent, but also trying to take away another tool of control in intimate partner abusive relationships. So there's some hope, research shows, in terms of addressing this issue. I already talked to you a little bit about the decline in gun use for intimate partner homicides. But in addition to that, published peer-reviewed research has shown increasingly that when a court orders that firearms are surrendered by someone who's prohibited, in fact, it's much more likely that the abuser will surrender, turn in the gun to law enforcement, or pass it on to someone that prevents them from accessing that gun. In addition to that, studies show that in communities, in states, and also there's some research around localities, large cities, which I'll talk about in a second, that where there are domestic violence prohibitions based on protection orders that require that folks not have access to guns or must turn in guns, there's a concomitant decrease in homicide and other violent crimes within those communities. So we have a citation to one of these kinds of studies that showed, actually a couple of the studies, showing that there was an intimate partner homicide reduction of 6% in a state level where it was looked at statewide where there's domestic violence protection order prohibition versus states that don't have such prohibitions. And in a study by April Zioli and Daniel Webster published in 2010, there was almost a 20%, a 19% reduction in large cities where the protection order code prohibited an abuser from having access to a gun. So so there does appear to be some efficacy to these laws being in place. In addition, there's research that if you look at the research, you see that in places where a person cannot have a gun, who's an abuser, there does not appear to be a substitution of the gun for a different weapon to commit an intimate partner homicide. So in these studies that show a decrease, the intimate partner homicide decrease by guns is parallel with an overall intimate partner homicide decrease. So those abusers are not finding other ways to kill their victims. And as many have pointed out, including our former Vice President Joe Biden, the access to a gun can be the difference between a survivor who survives the abusive incident versus one who is killed or very seriously injured. So another reason for hope in these kinds of efforts that we're engaged in. I'm going to turn it back over to Nancy.
Thank you, Darren. So, So apart from the scope of the problem as a justification for the project, another basis for the project is all that we've learned from many years of providing technical assistance on domestic violence and firearms. We have worked with diverse communities around the country on efforts to improve their response to firearms and domestic violence, and a number of themes have emerged from that work, which spans over the last 2 decades. One of the main ones is the central importance of leadership in the community, whether it's judicial leadership, law enforcement leadership, any form of, it could be multiple forms of leadership, but it's critical to have that leadership to ensure successful efforts. The second significant theme is that how important meaningful collaboration is. And by meaningful collaboration, we mean coordinated, mutually supportive work by all of the stakeholders in the community, where there's a lot of honest communication and openness to feedback and a real commitment to sorting out problems and working together. A third theme is the importance of assessing and mapping the process in your community so that you understand where the gaps are and what the opportunities are for addressing those gaps. A fourth one is the importance of honoring the victim's voice and autonomy in the process. A fifth one is the importance of honoring due process protections for adverse parties. Some of these have been discussed in the previous webinars that we've had, and I will be mentioning those later, so we're not delving into the details of all of this so much today, but just talking generally about the themes. And then finally, the central importance of community engagement and culturally specific practices, and that you'll hear a little bit more about today. So we wanted to identify some of the benefits for communities of participating in the FTAP. First and principally, we are going to be providing intensive ongoing technical assistance from a dedicated TA team. That TA team will be identified once the sites have been selected, and the TA teams will be selected based on the characteristics of the communities and their needs and what issues they need to be addressing. And so you will have that team of folks working with you for at least 2 years and likely longer. That team could draw from national experts on multiple topics, but we also, even if they're not members of the team, we have a host of national experts on multiple topics representing diverse professional backgrounds. And in fact, there's a list under the materials called the FTAP Project Partners, and if you look at that later, you'll see the list of collaborating project partners that we have on board with us. Additionally, selected sites will be part of peer-to-peer consultations with other sites that have implemented strategies that have worked for them. There'll be mentoring from those sites as well, and a lot of cross-fertilization of strategies between the sites that have been selected, with a sharing of lessons learned, not only between the project sites, but out into the larger community. One thing that we don't have listed here, but I want to mention briefly, is that there also in this project, is in our budget for the project, is funding for travel for the sites. That would encompass travel to meetings or travel around the state or the jurisdiction to participate in meetings or site visits, that kind of thing. We know that there is no funding available in this particular project for a project coordinator, but we know that there are some possibilities for funding, and you all can be thinking about state and local funding. There's a possibility of other OVW funding, there's STOP funding, ICJR funding, and it's completely possible that you could be putting in applications that would help fund this work. So just wanted to acknowledge that. I am going to pass it off to Carolyn at this point. Before we describe the objectives of the project, we want to give Caroline and Tricia a chance to talk about the impact in marginalized communities. Caroline?
Hi, everybody. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Nancy. This is Caroline again. So I think one thing, certainly as being a project partner on this project, that I have really appreciated was the emphasis on making sure that that there were applicants for this project from Indian country, and that a site could possibly be selected from Indian country. So just really quickly to outline some efforts that have already undergone to address firearms and DV in Indian country from this project. So originally there was a firearms forum breakout in May of 2015, a tribal advocates questionnaire in 2016, and then we had a fairly large tribal convening in January of 2017. This convening included professionals from tribal communities across the country. We were able to all come together, identify challenges and possible solutions to better protect victims in our communities from firearms, specifically in domestic violence cases, which we know American Indians and Alaska Natives suffer from much higher rates of. We also discussed many of the obstacles and opportunities that present themselves in tribal communities. So challenges to addressing firearms in DV in Indian country, this is just a way to sort of simply boil it down. There are many challenges, and this list is definitely not meant to be exhaustive, but rather illustrative. A lot of what tribal leaders and advocates came together in January and identified was, first, there was just a substantial lack of resources, right? I think anybody that works in Indian country is well aware of that issue. There are some cultural considerations, so pieces around balancing victim safety versus cultural traditions. This certainly includes subsistence hunting, specifically in areas like Alaska, for example. There's a loss of cultural identity and traditions, again, both sort of with the removal of a firearm and the presence of one. I think you can make arguments for both. And then a lack of services for victims and abusers. It's going to be interesting to see how that fourth challenge plays out now that we have secured VOCA funding, so hopefully that a little bit of that changes. But again, that piece of it plus the lack of resources will continue to be a significant barrier.
Caroline?
Yes.
Excuse me, I just wanted to interject for a second. I'm sorry. Folks are having a little bit of trouble hearing you. If you're sounding a little muffled and your sound is going in and out. I don't know if you can speak a little louder or there's something else going on. Sorry.
No problem. I hope maybe this is clearer. I'll wait to see if somebody...
That sounds better.
Okay, perfect. Can we go back to that slide? I'll just go back over that really quickly.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so the challenges identified, I'm not going to rehash that whole piece, but one, lack of resources. Two, balancing victim safety, which is certainly a tradition in Indian country. You know, violence is not one of our traditions. And then versus cultural traditions that we have. That very much includes subsistence hunting, especially in places like Alaska, for example. There's a loss of cultural identity and traditions, and then a lack of services for victims and abusers. It's going to be interesting, like I said previously, to see how that fourth bullet point plays out, given the recent VOCA funding that tribes should be able to now access.
Mm-hmm.
So to sort of continue on in the challenges to addressing firearms in DV in Indian country, most people are aware that tribes, even as sovereigns, right, have serious jurisdictional issues to combat in their communities, especially as they seek to address domestic violence in a meaningful way, right? First, lack of jurisdiction over non-native offenders. You know, I think a lot of people don't consider how many non-natives we have living on tribal lands. And then furthermore, don't necessarily consider that under Supreme Court case law, we don't have jurisdiction, criminal jurisdiction specifically over those offenders. Part of that was fixed with the Violence Against Women Act of 2013. So if you are an implementing tribe, or just in reference to implementing tribes in general, those tribes can now prosecute non-natives for a certain subset of crimes. It's very limited in scope, but it does apply to domestic violence, dating violence, and criminal violations of protection order. There is difficulty in obtaining assistance from local, state, and federal counterparts, especially, again, regarding enforcement of protection orders. And there are, as always, ongoing information and database sharing issues. You know, most tribes don't have access to NCIC, so the federal criminal databases. I believe there's only around 20 tribal access program tribes currently, so hopefully that program gets expanded. And then there are collaboration challenges both within tribes and between tribal and external professionals or other partners such as state law enforcement. Okay, so addressing firearms in deviant Indian country strengths and creative solutions. One of the things that was really sort of heavily identified at the Firearms convening in 2017 was that the use of traditional practices to address these challenges is actually best, right? I think most people that work in Indian country know that we want to take a sovereign approach, but also one that's culturally relevant. And we definitely heard a lot of that at the convening itself. In this way, there's the restoration of lost cultural values. Again, domestic violence not being one of those values. Firearms. One of the solutions identified was that firearms could be held by elders when an abuser is not hunting. Another solution that's been identified just sort of in the realm of subsistence hunting, right, is that proxy hunters. So instead of the person who is subject to protection order or has had a firearm removed from them, not allowed to possess a firearm, instead of them participating in that hunt, the tribe or the village would, in theory, hunt on their behalf while they contributed something else to the community. And that sort of speaks to this third point that, you know, we don't necessarily always have to have criminal justice solutions. You know, the Western legal system is not one that Native Americans created, and sometimes it's not one that works for us either. So certainly including restorative justice practices where it's appropriate. Another solution, or certainly a strength, was, again, tribes, as sovereign nations, we have to engage in government-to-government consultation. And so in that way, we are able to elevate our issues to decision makers in the federal government. So this is one of those issues that I think, you know, ongoing will sort of continue to be an issue at consultation.
Okay.
And then again, you know, just to close out the tribal piece, you know, the partners are committed to assisting project sites with these challenges in Indian country and to sharing lessons learned with other tribal communities. So again, if you are on the call from a tribal community, we do really encourage you to apply.
Thank you, Caroline.
No problem.
Now, Tricia is going to describe briefly the importance of culturally specific practices and working with underserved communities.
Thanks, Nancy. And I also want to thank Caroline because her presentation really highlights the importance of ensuring a culturally specific approach for each of the sites. And so what she talked about really does highlight a couple of different elements of what would be important in your culturally specific practices. So being culturally proficient, being culturally competent allows you to identify gaps and barriers to firearm prevention and domestic violence related homicide prevention. It also helps you to identify from within the community those strengths and those assets that exist that can help you and, you know, really support the work that you're doing as it relates to firearm prevention and domestic violence homicide prevention. We also know that cultural practices, indigenous practices, really have been effective in providing supports to communities, but also in terms of creating and uplifting those effective approaches that are within different cultural groups that have been found to be useful for that population. And then finally, another really important reason to ensure that you're engaging in culturally specific work is to ensure the sustainability of the project. So it's really important to remember that, as Nancy mentioned, you know, there'll be the support that will be there for TA and training for those 2 years and possibly beyond that. But what we're really looking for is for sites to be able to continue the work past the support. And so being able to engage those different communities, being able to use a culturally specific approach will help to aid the sustainability of your project. The next slide, in terms of some of the expectations for sites, what would that actually look like on the ground? So one thing that we're looking for are sites that are interested in or have already been engaging in work with culturally specific organizations in their respective communities. It would be great for sites to have a knowledge of the key stakeholders from the different cultural groups and from the different diverse communities that exist there in your local site. So it would be expected that sites that participate would engage in a form of a community assessment and be able to take that assessment and actually implement some community engagement strategies that would support the work of diverse communities within that site. We also will be able to provide technical assistance around organizational assessments. So having sites even be able to look within their organizations to assess their cultural competence, their cultural proficiency, and what it is that they need to do to get better to engage these different communities so that we can be impactful and effective in firearm prevention related to DV homicide. And the other area that sites will participate in is being able to receive a wealth of training and technical assistance as it relates to community engagement strategies for different populations, as well as really strengthening the ability to provide culturally responsive practice. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Nancy.
Thank you, Tricia. So with that sort of overview, because it was just an overview, but we want to move on with the objectives of the project. And if you've listened to some of the earlier webinars, you may recognize that the objectives of the project are, we've mentioned them before, but we are going to be providing intensive technical assistance to probably 5 to 7 diverse project sites. I mean, that's our goal, is 5 to 7 sites that are working to improve their response to firearms in criminal and civil domestic violence cases. And as mentioned in the solicitation, it can be just a criminal side of things or just the civil side or both. So we are open to applications in either or both areas. The other objective is to obtain and disseminate information about what are the effective strategies and what are some of the lessons that we're learning from communities that have been working on this or are trying out new strategies, modifying forms that have been used in other jurisdictions. So we want to obtain and disseminate that information among the sites initially and then more widely later. Third objective is to identify approaches that protect victims, children, and others while promoting victim autonomy and while safeguarding offenders' due process rights. We mentioned those themes earlier, and they are themes that, are threaded throughout the strategies that we have been employing in communities, and we will be continuing to identify those approaches that safeguard both of those things. And finally, we have an objective of facilitating peer-to-peer mentoring with sites and other information sharing between sites. and opportunities for problem solving. There will be all site visits where teams from all of the selected sites will be coming together to both share ideas and also do some problem solving and identify some collaborations that might work for them. The structure of the project, again, we're choosing 5 to 7 sites. Included in that will be 2 tribal communities. Within those sites, we're seeking as broad a diversity as we can get, both geographic diversity, demographic diversity, diversity in the legal framework in those jurisdictions. Some jurisdictions have very strong state laws. Other jurisdictions may have no firearms laws that are directly related to the domestic violence arena. So we expect to have a variety of legal frameworks. Also diversity in leadership. You could have judicial leadership, as I mentioned, or law enforcement leadership, prosecution and advocate leadership. Leadership can come from many different directions, and we just know that we'll be looking for a variety of that. And also in the challenges, of course, that each community will be describing in their applications. So we're seeking to get the broadest possible array of challenges within these sites as well. As I mentioned, we'll focus on both civil and criminal domestic violence cases. You can choose where you want to focus in your jurisdiction. We will also focus on incorporating the voices and needs of traditionally underserved and or marginalized communities, as we've just been hearing from Tricia and Caroline. And so part of the process of both applying and then being a site will be to, identify, if you don't already know what those communities are, identify and then obviously work with those communities as the project unfolds. We will be providing intensive TA and training, peer-to-peer mentoring, and idea sharing, as we've mentioned a few times. And as I mentioned already, that we do anticipate some funding for travel to meetings and site visits and training opportunities. And I was going to mention again that if you haven't, this is a point where if you want to be sure and look at the list of project partners, that will help you get an idea of the many TA providers that are involved in this project who will be available to help with all of these aspects of the project. So the timeline that we have right now, the request for proposals was released at the end of July, and the applications are due in the middle of October. We are expecting to conduct site visits to potential project sites during the latter part of the year, beginning of next year, with plans to notify the selected sites by March 1st. So what will happen after March 1st is that we will commence planning and the implementation of project activities at each of the sites, and that will continue through the fall of 2021 at a minimum. This is sort of another version of the same time frame. This is in the solicitation, and you'll see that there is a planning phase which will start after the sites are selected next spring. And in partnership with us and all of our TA partners that are helping, partner TA providers, you'll be putting together a local collaborative team and engaging in some self-assessment activities to identify the challenges and the strengths in your community and to begin to develop project goals. We're planning to have an all-sites meeting next summer where teams from the selected communities will come together with OVW, with NCJFCJ, and all of the project partners, and that meeting will be an opportunity for training and collaborative relationships to develop, as well as just getting some more planning together. There will be some effort to continue the planning process that sites will be involved in. And then starting in the fall of next year would really be when the project would be commencing to implement the goals and objectives that the sites will have been formulating over the previous months in collaboration with their team, their collaborative team members, and in consultation with the TA team that will be derived from the TA providers that we have listed. And if there's any questions about this time frame towards the end, we can definitely go over some of that.
So to reiterate a little bit what we're going to do here, the initial activities will be around the formation of your local management team that really has a day-to-day management of the project itself, and then the broader collaborative team that will bring together stakeholders who all work with survivors around these issues, who are involved in response when someone has a firearm in a domestic violence case, and other critical folks in the civil and criminal justice system. So getting those groups together and to buy in to the project activities is a critical early activity. Then once that's formulated, or mostly formulated, the assessment activities that are contemplated are ones that we've used in other similar projects where we work intensively with sites. And a big piece of that is doing some mapping of your systems and identifying both the strengths and some of the challenges in your processes, and where there are opportunities to get better information about access to guns and then take steps to take those guns away from people who are prohibited would all be part of that assessment stage. We would be there, a TA team made up of typically national technical assistance providers with specific expertise on the challenges that you all are facing, would be there to facilitate and guide and support those kinds of activities to allow for the development of some very specific objectives and goals for your community's project. Those goals and objectives will look different for each of the sites, and that's part of what we're trying to do and why we're looking at some diversity, so we can learn the greatest number of lessons from this work as possible, and then ultimately disseminate and share them with others. We are using an all-sites meeting as a way to facilitate cross-fertilization of ideas and conversations about common themes and challenges that arise in this work. And so from previously working in a couple of similar projects, I can tell you that those all-sites meetings are really welcomed by the participants, and the opportunities to network and share are really, really valuable in doing this work. So we've built that into this project. By the end of this sort of planning phase, folks will have completed a set of very specific project objectives and goals, and have developed a plan for how to carry it all out and a timeline for doing so, and you'll all begin implementation of the actual project after that planning phase. During both that planning phase and the implementation phase, you will be fully supported by a dedicated technical assistance team that, again, is made up of experts who have experience with the very challenges that you all have identified and are working towards addressing as part of this project. So there'll be all kinds of support, regular conversations about the work and technical assistance, sharing of resources, speaking with others who have experience in this area. We can come and facilitate meetings, which sometimes can be helpful to have an outsider come in and do this. And of course, directed training that is responsive to the exact needs of your community. In addition, we have a cadre of national experts and professionals from other communities that have done some of this work who would be available to provide assistance and mentoring and just be there to share ideas and bounce things back and forth around your work. We are hoping and anticipate that we will be in a position with you all to help document and measure the effectiveness of your work. We don't know what this is going to look like. We're sure that there'll be some qualitative measures that we want to have in place, potentially some data and quantitative data to share. But as you'll see in the application, we do have questions around whether you are able to and willing to share this kind of data to help us document the work and help us move towards an understanding of what practices actually lead to improvements safety improvements for survivors and for the community. In addition, it's been mentioned a couple of times, and especially by Tricia, about the importance of this is a project that's going to have an end date, and we want to make sure that folks are able to continue this work, and that systems and processes and even positions that are put in place can be carried forward. So we are going to dedicate time as part of this project to work with you around sustainability of the project strategies that are developed and implemented as part of the FTAP.
Great, thanks, Darren. And I see there's a number of questions coming up, and we will get to those as we, if we don't get to them while we're still talking, we will get to them when we wrap up the presentation. So the application requirements that we're going to focus on today is the applicants that are eligible for this solicitation, the community characteristics that we're looking for, a statement of the problem or challenges to be addressed, who is going to implement the project, the letters of intent to collaborate, and the selection criteria. So first, we just want to emphasize that the eligible applicants is actually a pretty broad pool of entities. States and U.S. territories can apply, Indian tribes, Alaska Native villages, tribal consortia, states, tribal and local courts, units of local government. That can include prosecution offices, law enforcement offices, police departments, probation offices. It can, in any range of units of local government, victim service providers, and frankly other nonprofit community organizations that are, suited to be involved in this work. So we really wanted to cast a broad net and, include as many entities that might be likely to be interested in this work. As you can tell from the solicitation, we do expect collaboration with other stakeholders, so any given entity that is eligible to apply still needs to also be thinking about the other entities, the other organizations or governmental entities that they all need to establish relationships with as they work on the application and move forward with the project. But as I say, we were trying to be as broad as possible in identifying who is eligible to apply. As we've mentioned, we're seeking diversity of sites in a range of different areas. Geographic diversity, will be looking across the country to see if we can, but also rural versus urban, small communities versus large metropolitan jurisdictions, demographic diversity, which obviously can be huge, range of demographics that would be involved. Legal framework, everything from states that have strong state laws on firearms surrender to no law on firearms surrender and maybe just a catch-all provision. Maybe you even have a law, maybe you're lacking a law other than the federal law, you don't have a state law. So we anticipate hearing from different jurisdictions, and we want to work in all of those different arenas because we believe there is meaningful work to be done in all of those legal frameworks, and we are not premised on the idea that the sites that can do the best work are the ones that have the strongest laws and have already figured things out. That's the whole nature of this project, is to be able to work with communities where they're at, but and this is kind of addressing one of the questions, we're not expecting anybody to have figured this work out. That's the jurisdiction might have experimented with some things that have worked or not worked, or it might be that you're at the beginning of your efforts to implement firearms in your jurisdiction. So we really are looking for a range of experience as well as these other things. Looking for a diversity in sites, sorry, did I move that? In terms of the system structure, whether you have integrated DV courts or family justice centers, even if you don't, that's something that we'll be taking a look at. We'll be looking at history of addressing firearms and domestic violence in your community and engaging in other collaborative efforts with both with federal partners and with other key stakeholders in your community on other initiatives that you've had. And a history of collaborating with culturally specific organizations and organizations or groups serving racially and ethnically diverse or historically marginalized communities. So again, this is something where we're not necessarily expecting everybody to have such a history, but we'll be looking at what knowledge of your community you have around culturally specific organizations and any experience that you have had with collaborating with culturally specific organizations and other groups, related groups. And then, of course, this last point about responding to all the questions in the solicitation are aimed at helping us to identify all of these different diverse characteristics of the communities that we're looking for.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the potential challenge areas. You can almost think about these as, for those of you who are used to applying for grant funding from OVW, as purpose areas, although these are just ideas of things you can work on, things that we have experience with. This is not an exclusive list, nor would you need to be addressing all these challenge areas, which would be impossible. But it's to give you a sense of the kind of work that we anticipate this project for various sites will involve, and for which we have expertise and ideas to help you all move forward with such a project. And I just want to, before I dive into it, briefly acknowledge that there are some excellent questions that are pending. I promise we will get to all of them as soon as we're done with this, the portion of the presentation. We do have answers for you. And thank you for answering those questions, because they're all ones that we definitely want to touch on before we're done this afternoon. So in terms of potential challenge areas, you'll see that we've identified We've asked applicants to specifically identify the challenges that, at least at this initial application stage, they think they intend to address. Of course, there's going to be an opportunity to change your mind and to find out new things to do. It may even be that you apply thinking, oh, I'm going to focus on my criminal system and getting guns out of the hands of people who are going through the criminal process. And then you realize that there's something you want to do around your civil protection order process. Certainly that will be a possibility. So you're not tied to anything necessarily, but it gives a good sense of both that you've thought through these ideas and that you're seeking to do things that are appropriate and within the scope of what we can offer as part of this project. So please do identify those challenges. And a big part of this, and one of the reasons we're asking you to do this, is because we've learned over the years, as Nancy said, that collaboration with key stakeholders, both discipline-specific stakeholders, but also, as we've mentioned several times, organizations that work specifically on community engagement and work on, but with racially and ethnically diverse and other historically marginalized communities, is really critical to the extent to the success of any of these kinds of projects. So collaboration is key, and we really do urge you in developing your application to reach out to others within your community and have a conversation specifically about what are some of the key challenges that we think a project like this could address. Are there things in our civil protection order system? Are there things in our criminal system? Are we concerned that orders are being issued, but guns aren't being turned in, despite the fact that orders requiring surrender have been issued? Is there some kind of follow-up that's not there? Is the court concerned because it's not hearing about which particular respondents may have access to guns? Is there problems communicating with the entity that's entering orders into databases, and there's not all orders are getting entered into the key databases that would stop purchases of guns? Is there a lack of collaboration with federal counterparts who can bring some prosecutions or can help in other ways? All those kinds of challenge areas. Have the conversations and see what you think are the gaps and potential areas to make some progress in this area. We really urge you urge you to do that as part of this application process. It builds gets some buy-in, and it lays the groundwork for some very successful collaborative work as you move through the project. You'll see on pages 3 to 5 of the solicitation that we have a pretty detailed, specific list of potential focus areas. And as I mentioned, some are criminal, some are civil, some are spend, both of those. Some are about collaboration with key stakeholders. Just because you don't have those collaborations now should not discourage you from applying. A big part of the work in this area we know, and we've done historically, is to help you engage with key stakeholders throughout your community and amongst the important professionals involved in this project. We really do want to help you with those kinds of things. We're not looking to work with sites that have a long-term, well-established collaborative partnership around this issue necessarily. Some of those sites may be perfectly appropriate for this project, but many of you who don't have those kinds of established relationships may be exactly the kind of communities where we can do some great work and others can learn from that work. So please, we encourage you to apply for sure, no matter where you are along that continuum. I already mentioned that the list is not exclusive, and if you have other ideas, please do put them in there. And in addition to that, to help you both think about challenge areas and also to understand a little better, since we have limited time today and aren't doing a substantive presentation on our work in this area, take a look at the web links. If you look below, hopefully everyone's set up the same way as mine, but in my case, below the PowerPoint presentation is a list of web links and also materials. Those web links include links to 3 different webinars that we have done as part of this project as it's evolved over the last year and a half or so. And they give you a very good sense of what we view as, and through our work, view as the challenges the community are facing, some of the solutions or potential strategies to address those problems, and also some ways to talk about this issue within your community to get engender greater buy-in. And we have a specific one that we did with Caroline around working in tribal communities to protect victims and others from guns. So please do take a look at those webinars. They're relatively short, and I think they'll give you some good insight into our approach to this particular issue. The webinar links are below, and they're also in this particular slide. So either way, you can get there.
Thanks, Darren. And I just really want to emphasize what Darren has said about the fact that we don't expect sites to have this all figured out. That's the whole purpose of the project, is to work with sites that might be at the very beginning of their efforts. And if you can visualize who would be stakeholders in your community that you can work with, and then obviously track them down and get them to agree to work with you, then that's the nature of where we're going to meet people at. You might be a jurisdiction where you've implemented some stuff and it works okay, but there's still some improvements to be made. I don't think we know of any jurisdiction where everything is working perfectly smoothly. So even if you're a jurisdiction that has some systems in place, but it's not working perfectly, that would be another entry point for us. So really don't want anybody to feel like there's going to be a contest between, oh my gosh, there's going to be 5 other jurisdictions who already know so much about what they need to do. That's not the case. We really want a range of experience out there so that we can at the end of this project, as a result of the work that we will have done, we can go to almost any community and say, oh, you're a small rural community in a rural state. We still have ideas for you, and we can work with you. Here's some lessons we've learned about that. Or if you're a large metropolitan jurisdiction in a big, so in other words, we really encourage everybody to think about wherever you are, as long as you can articulate the interest and the critical stakeholder engagement, then I think that you're on the path to putting a successful application together. Want to talk briefly about who will implement the project. This part of the application has you identifying the management team and the project leadership. As Darren mentioned earlier, that initial period after being selected as a site, you'll be assigned a TA team that will be 2 to 3 or more people who would be working with you to help you identify ways to build that management team and who should be on that management team. Of course, you'll know a lot of the stakeholders that should probably be on that team, but we will be available to help work through the logistics of that. Then we also have the collaborative team, which is a broader group of people and stakeholders in the community that is not the day-to-day management team of the project, but it encompasses all of the stakeholders who have either touch the system or have an impact on how it works, that would come together on lesser frequent basis, but they're still going to be apprised of what's going on with the project. We also need you to identify the roles of community-based, culturally specific organizations and organizations that serve racially and ethnically diverse populations or historically marginalized communities. Again, this is going along with what we heard from Tricia this morning or this afternoon, that this critical importance of reaching out to those groups to get knowledge about who they are, if that's where you're at, or if you're already in collaborative relationships with them, then we would be having you identify what those groups are and how they will be engaged in this project. And then I see, we're also asking you to identify how this Firearms TA project will intersect with other existing projects that you might have in your jurisdiction around your civil protection order system or your criminal justice system in general, or anything that you might have going on in your community that would be parallel or would dovetail with the Firearms TA project. Under the letters of intent to collaborate, we are requiring at least 2 project partners in addition to the applicant. And that, again, goes back to the question of being able to identify other stakeholders in your community that will want to work on this and agree to collaborate on the project. More letters are welcome, but 2 is sufficient. We strongly encourage letters from culturally specific organizations in your community and or those serving racially and ethnically diverse or historically marginalized communities. They can count as a project partner. Those can be in addition to, obviously if they could be one of the 2 project partners, that would be great. But again, if you're at a place where you're in the process of identifying what that culturally specific organizations are, we don't want you to feel like you can't apply. We need you to be willing to work on that, on reaching out to and identifying who those organizations are, even if you aren't able to get a letter of intent to collaborate. And then there's some specific requirements in the solicitation that talk about the capacity and the commitment to collaborate that you should be sure and note when they're writing their letters. So the selection criteria that we have that we will be basing the selection on is the capacity of the jurisdiction to coordinate an effective management team and fully participate in the project. Whether the community demonstrates strong leadership and a history of coordinated community response around domestic violence. And again, we want to emphasize that we know how important leadership and collaboration is, so that any instances where you can show where that leadership has been and where the collaboration has been demonstrated are going to be helpful. We'll be looking at the strength and effectiveness of systems advocacy efforts in the community, so you should be sure and describe those. We'll be looking at whether the community will enhance the diversity of project sites in terms of geography or demographics, in terms of their legal framework, the challenges that are going to be addressed, or other features that are unique. And we do understand that a lot of the challenges are going to be similar in each of these jurisdictions. I mean, the challenges are, very broadly how to get these firearms laws implemented, but still there will be variations. Another criteria will be the willingness and capacity of the community to evaluate your activities quantitatively as well as qualitatively. And we haven't talked much about this today. We're not expecting this to be a research project, but we do expect to meet sites where they are as far as helping to identify what are ways that you can measure the effectiveness of your efforts. And we'll be working with you at the outset to help you identify what those measurable qualities are. And then, of course, we'll be working with you to help continue, whether it's data collection or focus groups or however it is that it's measured, we would be working with you to help you identify how to do that. And then finally, meaningful inclusion of culturally specific organizations and organizations or groups that serve racially and ethnically diverse or historically marginalized communities, and commitment by those organizations to participate. So these are all factors that we'll be looking at as we review the applications. I think hopefully we've been successfully conveyed the fact that we expect a wide range of experience and of experience and characteristics among these sites, so that there is no perfect site that we're looking for. I think with that we are ready to go back to any questions that haven't been answered or any questions that people have at this point. Darren, I see that you've responded to a lot of them. Did you respond to the one about whether a DV coalition would be eligible?
I didn't respond. I think the person who asked said that she felt like the question was answered, but
okay.
We can talk a little bit about that. I mean, that raises a good question, like statewide efforts, organizations serving statewide, whether it's Domestic Violence Coalition or something else. This certainly is envisioned as an intensive technical assistance project that's going to help specific communities. So to the extent that such an application identifies a community or maybe a couple of communities, depending on capacity and everything, that would certainly be an appropriate project where we could work well with folks. To do something on an entirely statewide basis, I don't think we anticipated doing that. I'm not sure. I think we would have to consult with the Office on Violence Against Women and our project partners about what that could look like, because it really it seems much more manageable for us to be working with communities, and then hopefully these communities can serve to some degree as kind of learning laboratories, both for other folks in the state with which lessons learned can be shared, and also people outside of that part of the country.
I can't see any new questions that we haven't yet addressed. I think there was a question earlier about whether this was this project was the first of its kind.
Oh, right. There was a question like that.
And whether we, I'm scrolling back up, or whether some work has been implemented before. I mean, certainly there are communities around the country that have done work to implement firearms prohibitions, definitely. I don't believe it's been under any kind of project. They've been individual communities that have pursued this. Would you say that's right, Darren?
Yes, absolutely. This is the first of its kind in terms of a group of sites and a concentrated effort, and also we have, just like we're asking you to solicit the help of partners and engage in collaborative work. You already can tell, I think, from this afternoon's presentation, you've heard from a couple of our partners, and you have the list of all of our other project partners. who have committed to assist in particular areas in particular ways in this project. It really is, in terms of the technical assistance side, a very collaborative project, and I don't know of efforts in this area in the past that have been, so focused and intentionally collaborative in this way.
And we certainly hope we haven't scared anybody off. Are there any other questions coming from the presentation about the application, any details about the application or the overall project?
I see someone's typing, here we go. Can the project address both civil and criminal at the same time? Absolutely. We're able to help with both or one or the other. And I think I mentioned earlier, it may be that you would start off with some ideas around one process and then realize that you want to work on others. And absolutely, we can help with both. And part of the planning process will be trying to figure out how to manage to address both, within the confines of a particular project. But there's no question we've helped communities work on both systems simultaneously.
Yep.
Others are typing, and in the meantime, Nancy, do you want to say a word about moving forward if folks have questions during the application process, what they should do?
Well, are you thinking, first of all, my address is on this, my email address is on this resource list. It's also listed in the solicitation, but right there under National Council, that phone number is a good phone number, but it's not my direct line. But the best way to reach me is by sending me an email. And I would suggest that if you do have specific questions, you can email me. We also plan to have another Q&A session about the application, just in case there's some lingering questions or new people decide to apply. And by the way, we are recording this webinar, and it will also be available for listening by others or by you. But we plan another webinar, I believe, on September 5th. And it's just going to be an opportunity to ask questions. It's just going to be a 1-hour forum for asking questions. It's not a presentation, but are you thinking of anything else, Darren?
No, that's it. A couple of other questions came in the meantime. Jordan Ferguson's asked whether this can be a work in progress, expanding as more information is discovered, and certainly this is the kind of project where we really want to meet communities where they are and sort of travel down this path with you all. And certainly things change over time, and especially you notice, more information is learned. It may be that in doing the work you discover a previously concealed problem, something that you didn't know was a problem, that then becomes a big project focus. And we're happy to travel with you along that pathway. It's not like the original implementation plan is something that's written in stone with a set of specific deliverables. We want to be flexible and responsive to what you learn. But in addition to that, it may be that we learn new approaches as we go through this project, and Community A is doing something really interesting that could help Community C that we didn't know about at the beginning of the project, and it may be that Community C would start to shift some of its focus to try to do some kind of adaptation, implementation of what's happening in Community A. So certainly, yes, a lot of flexibility in doing the work. And then there's a question about whether we can provide a list of cities and communities that we've worked with so that you all can do some due diligence and see what their experience has been. And I think that we may be able to share some information. I think we would not want to do it without getting the permission of folks that we've worked with, so we can look at doing that. I do have to say that that we have not, as we mentioned earlier, none of our work with communities to date has been as extensive as what's being envisioned in this project. And
right.
So many of the communities we've worked in, we just haven't had the resources in this way. Thanks to OVW's generosity and support in this project, we now have more resources as technical assistance providers to dedicate to this work. And so in the past, some of those efforts have been, trainings and then a little bit of follow-up. There have been a couple of key communities that we've worked with on over a longer period of time, and we certainly can check in with them to see if they're willing to talk to you all at this stage. But let's look into that a little bit. I think it's a good question. You all need to do your due diligence as well.
Right, and I think even the communities that we have worked in, it's not like I said, there's no community that has figured this all out and is just humming along. So, everybody continues to engage in the work and try to address the challenges that they have. So, no community has finished and crossed it off their list, I would say. But we can try to get down to a few that we can mention to you. Well, so we will, as I said in response to one of the questions, I did say that we will be sure and send the information about the September 5th webinar to any of those who registered for today's, and then so you'll hear, you can register for that one too, and you can participate in that Q&A at that time, and you're welcome to email me in the meantime. Patricia has also posted the evaluation in the little chat box. It's also down below in the web links. So, we'd love to hear from you about the webinar itself, but if there's a question that you think of after we've closed, you could always put it in your evaluation form and we can follow up there. So there's several ways that you can get questions answered between now and whenever you submit an application. Tricia or Caroline, is there any concluding remarks you want to add before we close? Not sure that they're still there.
Yes, I'm still here. This is Tricia.
Oh, okay.
I just want to echo to everyone that we're looking forward to really working and collaborating with sites. There's so much to learn, and I think, one thing that people will find is that there's a great team that's willing to come together and work through, as Darren said, any challenges that come up, but also all the successes that will come along the way. So we're pretty excited to see sort of how that will unfold. And I just want to say that, we're looking forward to the next steps of some new discoveries and, really strengthening the work that we're doing in communities across the country. So thanks for joining us today.
Yeah.
And this is Caroline. I will just echo what Tricia said, and just, again, hopefully there are some applicants from some tribal communities or from some communities that have tribes in their areas that they work with.
Yep. Well, thank you all for joining us today, and please do fill out the evaluation and take a look at the previous webinar links, because those help to describe some of the strategies that we have been using in other jurisdictions. So if you're curious about how, what kind of things we have been used around the country, you can take a look at the webinar. The first two webinars focus on that, and then the third webinar is more informative about how to overcome some of the resistance in your own community to doing this work. So those are all informative for helping you think about who needs to be at the table and how you need to put together your application. But thank you, and we look forward to getting a letter of intent from you.
Thank you, everyone, and please apply.